The first scream did not echo. It was swallowed by fog. Along the eastern coast of England, with a North Sea breeze cold and gray, a convent bell once rang at dawn. It rang every morning, steady, faithful, unchanging. On this morning, it rang unfinished. Halfway through its call, iron met bone. The bell fell silent. The women inside never understood what was happening until the doors were already breaking. History remembers the Vikings as warriors, explorers, and legends. It forgets what happened to the women who could not fight back, especially the women who had taken vows of silence, chastity, and obedience. The Christian nuns of early medieval Europe believed their walls protected them. They believed their God would intervene. He did not. Between the late 8th and early 11th centuries, Viking raiders targeted monasteries and convents with calculated brutality. These were not accidental victims of war. These were chosen targets, isolated, wealthy, undefended, and full of women whose suffering would never be recorded in detail, because shame survives longer than memory. In the year 793, when Norse longships first struck the monastery of Lindisfarne, the Christian world gasped in horror. Chroniclers described monks butchered at the altar, relics stolen, holy books burned. But what they did not describe, what they barely dared to hint at, were the screams from the women's houses attached to these religious sites. The Vikings knew exactly what nuns represented. They were purity. They were defiance. They were symbols of foreign gods standing on pagan soil. And breaking symbols sends messages louder than any sword. If faith was your only shield, would it save you? The early Viking Age was not random chaos. It was strategy. Scandinavian societies in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were driven by population pressure, political ambition, and a hunger for silver. Monasteries and convents held all three things Vikings wanted: wealth, hostages, and terror value. Nuns, in particular, were considered high-value captives, not because of respect, but because of humiliation. To a Christian society obsessed with chastity, violating a nun was worse than killing her. To a Viking raider, that made her more valuable alive. Anglo-Saxon and Frankish sources use careful language. Words like defiled, dishonored, taken, and led away appear again and again. These were not euphemisms of politeness. They were euphemisms of trauma. Medieval chroniclers were priests, men sworn to modesty, writing for audiences that believed rape was a spiritual contamination, not just a physical act. One Frankish annal from the 9th century describes a convent raid in modern-day France, stating that the holy virgins were carried off to shame, their cries unheard by heaven. No names are given. Names would make it real. Names would demand accountability. And accountability was impossible, because the attackers vanished back into the sea. The Norse did not see nuns as sacred. They saw them as trophies. In Viking culture, honor was not universal. It was tribal. Foreign women, especially Christian women, did not fall under the protection of Norse moral codes. Captured women could be enslaved, sold, or forced into concubinage. Archaeological evidence and later saga references confirm that many enslaved women in Scandinavia were foreign, pale-haired, and Christian. Some were nuns. Imagine the psychological horror. A woman raised in silence, prayer, and ritual, dragged barefoot onto a longship, her habit torn away, surrounded by men who did not speak her language, sailing to a land she believed was hell. And for many it was. Viking raids escalated throughout the 9th century. Ireland, Scotland, Francia, Saxony, nowhere was safe. Convents were often located outside city walls, intentionally isolated to encourage spiritual reflection. That isolation became a death sentence. Or worse, the annals of Ulster record multiple attacks on women's religious houses, noting that the maidens of God were taken in bondage. Bondage was not metaphorical. It meant forced labor, forced sex, forced survival. Some women never returned. Others did, years later, pregnant, broken, and unwelcome. Christian society did not know what to do with them. A nun who survived rape was considered spiritually compromised, even though she was a victim. Her body had been violated, and that violation was treated as permanent. Some convents refused to accept returned captives. Others forced them into lifelong penance. A woman could survive the Vikings only to be punished by her own faith. This is why chroniclers remain vague. To describe the act was to admit the failure of God's protection. And yet, the attacks continued. In 845, Vikings sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris. While Paris itself was fortified, surrounding religious houses were not. Female captives were paraded, exchanged, and sold. Slavery markets in Dublin and Hedeby thrived on human cargo. Female captives fetched higher prices than men, especially young ones, especially virgins. By the time of the so-called Great Heathen Army in the late 9th century, the terror was institutionalized. Vikings were no longer hit-and-run raiders. They were settlers. And with settlement came normalization. What once shocked Europe became expected. Convents fortified their doors. Some disguised their women as men. Others fled inland. Many were caught anyway. There are hints, only hints, of ritualized humiliation. Christian sources accuse Vikings of mocking prayers, forcing captives to renounce Christ, and violating them on altars. These accounts are debated by historians, but their consistency across regions suggests a pattern of symbolic violence. This was not just sexual violence. It was theological warfare. To defile a nun was to declare her God powerless. By the 10th century, Viking leaders like Rollo began converting to Christianity, not out of faith, but politics. Raids slowed. Settlements stabilized. But the damage was done. Thousands of women vanished into slavery. their names erased, their suffering unrecorded, and history moved on. But ask yourself this. If the worst crime imaginable is never spoken, did it ever really happen? In the next descent into this story, the fate of these women after capture, inside Viking households, slave markets, and forced concubinage, reveals why many would later say death would have been kinder. Subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past. The journey did not end at the shore. That was only the beginning. Once the longships left the coast, the rules of the Christian world dissolved completely. Time blurred into cold, hunger, and the constant movement of water beneath wooden planks. For captives, especially nuns, there was no longer a future measured in days or prayers. Only survival measured in moments. Hands bound, eyes lowered, silence enforced by fear. Viking ships were not built for mercy. They were narrow, crowded, and unforgiving. Captives were kept low, near the ballast stones, where seawater pooled and sickness spread quickly. Some women died before landfall. Their bodies were pushed overboard without ceremony. No names, no prayers, no burial. For the rest, the destination was worse. Major Viking trade centers were not only hubs of silver and weapons, they were human markets. Places like Dublin and Hedeby thrived on the buying and selling of people. Slavery was not a side effect of Viking raids. It was a foundation of their economy. Captured women were stripped of identity the moment they arrived. Habits torn away, hair cut, or left loose to signal availability. Christian symbols, crosses, prayer beads, were ripped from their bodies, sometimes burned in front of them. This was not practical. It was symbolic, a declaration that their former lives were dead. Slave traders assessed women like livestock, teeth checked, hips measured, age guessed. Virgins were especially valuable, not for romance, but for status. A man who owned a virgin slave demonstrated power, not only over her body, but over the god who once claimed it. Some nuns were sold immediately, others were kept. Concubinage in Viking society occupied a gray space between wife and slave. A concubine had no legal protection, no consent, and no right to refuse. She could be used, discarded, traded, or killed without consequence. For a nun, whose entire identity had been built around spiritual purity, this existence was a living annihilation, and the psychological violence was constant. Forced participation in pagan rituals, exposure to gods they had been taught were demons, mockery of prayers, laughter during moments of resistance. Some captives were pressured to renounce Christianity, not with arguments, but with exhaustion and pain. Conversion under duress was common, though sincerity is unknowable. What is known is that many resisted, and resistance was punished. Saga literature, though written later and often romanticized, contains unsettling hints. Enslaved foreign women who refused obedience were beaten, starved, or publicly humiliated. While sagas rarely name nuns specifically, the descriptions align closely with what Christian sources feared but could not say aloud. Sexual violence was not always immediate. Sometimes it was delayed. Anticipation itself became a weapon. Pregnancy brought no mercy. A child born to an enslaved woman inherited her status. A nun's child was born a slave, proof, in Viking eyes, that the Christian God had failed twice, once to protect the mother, and again to sanctify the child. Some women tried to end their lives. Christian doctrine forbade suicide, but captivity tested faith beyond endurance. There are scattered references to women throwing themselves into rivers, refusing food, or provoking execution. These acts were rarely recorded in detail, but their shadows remain between the lines of medieval texts. For those who survived long enough, something worse awaited. Forgetting. Years passed. Languages changed. Memories dulled. A woman taken at 16 might still be alive at 40, but no longer remembered her prayers clearly, no longer remembered the sound of convent bells, no longer remembered who she had been before the raid. This was the true horror, not death, but erasure. Christian communities knew this was happening. Letters from bishops and abbots begged kings for protection, describing women taken into heathen darkness. Ransoms were sometimes paid, but rarely for nuns. Their families were gone, their convents destroyed. Their value was spiritual, not political. No one negotiated for them. When some women did return, through ransom, escape, or release, they returned to a world that did not know how to receive them. Their bodies carried evidence of what had happened. Their silence was interpreted as guilt. In some cases, they were barred from taking communion. In others, they were forced into permanent isolation. They were alive, but they were no longer considered pure. This is why medieval writers avoided details. To describe the suffering of nuns was to confront an unbearable contradiction. That devotion did not guarantee protection, and that innocence did not prevent destruction. So the records remain fragmented, cold, incomplete. But when pieced together, Christian annals, archaeological evidence, saga hints, and silence itself, a pattern emerges that cannot be ignored. The Vikings did not merely kill. They transformed living women into proof of dominance. And for many nuns, that transformation into property, into silence, into something unrecognizable was worse than death. If you think this horror ended with slavery, you are wrong. Because in the final part of this story, we confront what history almost never discusses. How these violations reshaped Christian law, memory, and fear, and how Europe carried this trauma long after the longships were gone. Subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past. The terror did not fade when the raid slowed. It settled. It hardened. It reshaped the Christian world in quiet, permanent ways. In the decades after the worst Viking incursions, Europe changed how it thought about women, sanctity, and protection, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. The wounds left by the violations of nuns were not only physical or spiritual, they were institutional, legal, cultural. Fear became policy. Convents were no longer built as places of peace. They became fortresses. Stone walls thickened, windows narrowed, doors were reinforced with iron. Some female houses were relocated close to castles or placed directly under the authority of male monasteries, not for guidance, but for protection. Women who had once lived apart in spiritual independence were now watched, guarded, and controlled. The irony was brutal. The same faith that failed to protect them now restricted them even further. Church councils across Francia and England quietly adjusted canon law. Survivors of sexual violence, especially nuns, were reclassified. Officially, the church insisted that violation did not erase spiritual worth. In practice, it treated violated women as dangerous reminders of vulnerability. Many were barred from leadership roles. Some were forbidden from ever taking vows again. A woman could be attacked by pagans and punished by her own god's representatives. This produced a deep, unspoken fear inside religious communities. Young women hesitated before entering convents. Families hesitated before offering daughters. Mothers remembered the raids. Fathers remembered the screams. Faith was no longer enough to justify the risk. And yet, the silence remained absolute. No sermons described what happened to the nuns. No hymns mourned them. No saints were canonized for enduring the suffering. Martyrdom required death. Survival was uncomfortable. So Europe bared the story. But trauma has a way of resurfacing, especially in myth. Medieval folklore across England, Ireland, and France began to fill with spectral women, white-clad figures wandering ruins, weeping women near rivers, silent nuns haunting abandoned convents. These were not coincidence. They were cultural memory leaking through narrative cracks. Ghosts were easier to face than survivors. At the same time, Viking society itself began to change. Conversion to Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries. Churches replaced temples. Crosses replaced hammers. Former raiders became Christian kings. But conversion did not undo the past. Some of the women taken decades earlier were still alive, now elderly, still enslaved, still nameless. Others had died without confession, without burial, without record. When Scandinavia became Christian, there was no reckoning, no apology, no acknowledgement. The silence became mutual. Historians today face the same problem medieval chroniclers did. Evidence that exists precisely because it is incomplete. We know raids happened. We know women were taken. We know slavery was widespread. We know Christian writers were terrified to describe sexual violence directly. What we do not have are the voices of the nuns themselves. Not a single first-person account survives. That absence is not accidental. Women in captivity did not write. Women who returned were discouraged from speaking. Their pain threatened the theological order of the world. If God allowed this, then what did faith mean? So the question was never asked publicly. Instead, fear shaped behavior. Religious houses withdrew from coasts. Communities avoided isolation. And the image of the Viking transformed from pagan warrior to embodiment of unchecked brutality. This image, passed down through generations, hardened into legend. But legends simplify. The truth is more disturbing. What happened to Christian nuns during the Viking Age was not an anomaly. It was a logical result of a world where power, gender, faith, and violence collided, and women paid the price in silence. They were not killed quickly. They were not remembered gloriously. They were not honored afterward. They were erased. And that erasure became tradition. By the High Middle Ages, the church would speak endlessly about purity, obsessively. Virginity became currency. Female bodies became symbols to be guarded at all costs. Behind this obsession was memory, a memory no one dared articulate. The Vikings were gone, but the fear they left behind endured. If you've listened this far, understand this. History is not only what is written, it is what people were too afraid to write down. And sometimes, the most horrifying truths are preserved not in words, but in silence, in law, in architecture, and in ghosts. In the final descent, we confront the question history avoids entirely. Why this story still matters, and what it reveals about how civilizations justify suffering when it is inconvenient to remember. Subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past. What remains is not a single event, but a pattern that refuses to disappear. When we look back at the Viking Age, popular culture gives us axes, shields, and heroic conquest. But beneath that mythology lies a quieter legacy, one built on bodies that were never counted and voices that were never allowed to speak. The suffering of Christian nuns was not collateral damage. It was a consequence of how power chooses its victims. These women were attacked precisely because they represented something fragile yet defiant. They were unarmed. They were visible. They embodied a faith that claimed moral authority in a world ruled by force. To violate them was to send a message, not just to the church, but to society itself. Nothing is sacred if you are strong enough to break it. And society learned that lesson. The aftermath of these crimes shaped Europe in subtle, lasting ways. Fear justified control. Silence became doctrine. Women's suffering was absorbed into theology as a test, a punishment, or a mystery, never as a crime demanding justice. The language used to describe violation grew evasive, coded, distant. Not because people did not know what happened, but because knowing created responsibility. Even modern history inherits this discomfort. When historians debate Viking brutality, discussions often turn technical, sources bias, exaggeration. What is rarely debated is why the most graphic details are missing. The absence itself is evidence. Cultures that record miracles in obsessive detail do not forget atrocities by accident. They forget them because remembering would collapse the moral structure they depend on. The nuns were inconvenient witnesses. They survived something the world did not want to explain. And so they vanished, not only into slavery, but into footnotes, euphemisms, and finally into nothing at all. This is why the story still matters. Because the mechanisms that erased these women did not disappear with longships and pagan gods. They evolved. They learned new languages. They still function wherever suffering is reframed as destiny, wherever victims are asked to remain silent for the sake of order, faith, or reputation. History tells us who held the swords. It rarely tells us who paid the price. So when we ask what the Vikings did to Christian nuns, the answer is not only found in raids, chains, and markets. It is found in what came after, in the laws that restricted survivors, the silence that followed them, and the memory that refused to carry their names. For many of these women, death would have ended the pain. What they endured instead was erasure, and that perhaps is the darkest legacy of all. If this story unsettled you, it should have, because history is not distant. It is a mirror, and sometimes what reflects is uncomfortable to face. Subscribe for more hidden horrors of the past.